Hi, my name is Kristi Brooks, and I will be hosting this podcast. I have been working as an author, an editor, and teaching creative writing and literature for 18 years now. Man, I feel old saying that. So that will probably be a lot of the focus of the podcast, but it'll be different because I also like to look at writing not as just an individual thing, but encapsulate it in the world it's in, which means pulling in relevant resources for historical time periods, like what was the writing, what was the author's frame of reference for this piece when they were writing, what were they most worried about. Science can be pulled into there. You can do overlap even with religion and mythology and the metaphysical. You can pull in feminist theory, and the idea is to look at it from a full 360-degree perspective. I was trying to do this through videos, but I'm not really good at using all of the features of video on YouTube, and I don't like video as much. I'm much better at talking. So that is where we're at right now. When I was growing up, my dad was a huge history nerd. He loves the Civil War and World War II mostly, but also Rome. I learned so much about Roman emperors before I was a teenager. Things that other people, I guess, didn't have. I remember one time where we grew up, he took me out to one of the sites of a Native American battlefield and was like, this is the site where the battle happened and so many people died. And I don't know, it was really interesting. He would do that on every road trip, and I used to hate it, and now it's one of my favorite memories. So that's how odd things happen when they get lodged in there. Also, for those of you who don't know me personally, I have a tendency to sometimes ramble and go off on tangents. It's my ADHD brain connecting things in real time. I have scripted these out, and I am trying very hard to stick to the scripts and to keep these under 15 minutes so that I can stay on point. If I go off on a tangent, I might let it stay in. It depends really on what I'm dealing with. So, the idea of this series will be to look at the world and look at literature and look at everything around us, art, all of it, from a 360-degree perspective. Because you cannot take it, slice it out of its time period and look at it without understanding that it is a product of all those other things. I think that was the one thing that always upset me when I was in English class in, say, high school, is that they would give you this piece of writing and they wouldn't explain anything to you. You would know nothing about the history in which it was written. You just would read, say, Jane Austen, and they wouldn't tell you anything about the period. Now, I'm not a big fan of British literature from that time period, and Jane Austen is one of my least favorites. However, had I been introduced to her as this is who she was, this was part of her life, these things interested her, this is how she wrote. I did not know until I started researching her in college that she used to write on little palm-sized pieces of paper under a table while sitting as a proper lady and greeting people. I did not know that she wrote under a pseudonym and that she had to hide that she was a female because people would not read the work of a woman. All of these things factor into her stories. And if you're aware of that, when you read them, you might have a better outcome for it. So it is just to try and help people think of things in a broader sense, maybe give them some more skills for critical thinking. If I throw ideas out there, if I say stuff that you don't agree with, guess what? You can disagree with it. It's not the end of the world. These are just my notices, my perceptions, my tie-ins, my ideas of how I think about such things. So, with that in mind, one of the things that I wanted to cover is the idea of ethnic literature and why people are so upset about embracing different points of view. I really don't get it. It isn't our story to tell, so why not broaden your horizon and listen to the different voices and ethnic groups and cultural groups that are saying these things? Why not give them a platform? To me, it makes more sense. There are things I didn't know for a very long time, even with a father who was so big about the Civil War and taught me a lot about slavery and oppression and slave rights. But until I actually went into the works progress page from the Library of Congress and started listening to the stories of the slave narratives that were collected in the 30s under the WPA project, I didn't know so much. I didn't know that when slaves were freed, some of them chose to stay, not because they loved their slave masters, but because they were terrified to leave. And I had to think about it, because in my mind, it's always, why didn't you just run as soon as they announced it? You must have liked it. But you hear them talking about how they had never been off the property. So how would you, if you had spent your entire life chained to a property, if you were beaten and degraded, and if everything done to you in your entire existence was to make you afraid to leave that property, and if you had no money, and no resources, and no food, and nowhere to go, and someone came by and said, you're free, what would you do? What would you do? Like, many times, many people didn't run away because they were terrified of the life outside. It was fear that kept them there, not love. And we take that and we twist that knowledge, that little bit of knowledge that some people stayed and didn't run, we take it and we twist it to our own narrative. Well, they must have stayed because it wasn't bad. And that's not true. They stayed because it was horrible. And they'd never been treated like humans, and no one had taught them how to survive on their own, or that they even could. So we can't tell that story because we can't imagine that situation. Another one of the most interesting ones I read, I can't remember if it was one that was audio recorded or if it was one that was transcribed, because there are some tapes and there are some that are written. I can't remember which one it was. But the lady talked about her mother was chained to the master's daughter because she was supposed to be married to someone she didn't love, and she was in love with someone else, and he thought that she would try to run away before her wedding night, and he was getting a very big dowry for her. And so he chained her to this pregnant slave in her bed so that she couldn't run away. And the slave gave birth in the bed, chained to this lady who was essentially, a piece of property just like her, because women didn't have rights either. So they were together on that bed, and her mother gave birth to her with the master's daughter helping. And it's both a horrible, horrible story of this situation and of these people who were seen as less than human, even though one still had power over the other. But having to do this thing together, having to bring this life into the world together, it was really, really interesting and humbling, and it opened my eyes to all of the ways in which we live and don't talk about, and all of the things that are not said and not remembered because they were lost. And it was those moments, the humanity in those moments, that pulled me in. And I read and listened to so many of the slave narratives. I used to assign my students to listen to at least 5 and write about their favorite 2. And then that way they would see this other side. And so when I taught ethnic literature, that was one of the very first things I did, so that they could get an idea of the voices that were not the dominant voices in literature, the main authors of the time period, the lens through which we view those historical moments. So I will put a link in to the slave narratives with the Library of Congress so that you can go and find them yourself if you choose to, and listen or read some of them and see just what was happening in that time period, and maybe give you a broader sense of knowledge and a broader base of understanding from which to start. And one of the important things to remember when we go on this journey together is that the reality that I have is not going to be the same that you have. Our experience when reading and interpreting a work, when looking at a piece of art, when viewing historical events, all of that has to do with our subjective reality, things that happened in our past that framed our point of reference for this world. And so it's okay to remember that we are different people and that we will have different thoughts on these things. So if you disagree with anything I say, that's okay. Your point of reference can be different than mine. My goal here is just to make people think, to give them a different alternative, to have them look at the world from a different point of view. And maybe you'll find something you agree with. Maybe it'll give you a different frame of reference. I hope so. Thank you for sitting through this first podcast with me. I hope you'll join me for many more. The first story that I want to cover is going to be Bram Stoker's Dracula. And so you have that to look forward to next week. Thank you. Bye.